It was a warm afternoon in the neighborhood, the kind of day when the sun painted everything golden and the air carried the smell of freshly cut grass. The young woman, who everyone in the community knew for her bright smile, was spending her time in the front yard with her dog. The dog was more than just a pet to her. He was her best friend, her companion in every sense of the word. Every day after work or school, she would rush home, drop her bag, and head outside to spend time with him. The neighbors were used to seeing the two together, walking down the street or playing fetch in the open field nearby. It was a bond that was easy to see and even easier to admire. That afternoon, she tossed a ball across the grass, laughing as her dog bounded after it with endless energy. The sound of paws against the ground, the wagging tail and the happy bark filled the air with joy. She sat down on the porch steps, watching him proudly. To her, these simple moments were the ones that mattered the most. She didn't need big events or flashy things. Her happiness lived in the loyal eyes of her dog and the quiet rhythm of her life. But sometimes, life changes in ways that no one sees coming. As she leaned back, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, she noticed two police cars turning slowly onto her street. The flashing lights weren't on, and there wasn't any sound of sirens, but the sight made her pause. Police cars weren't unusual in the city, but they didn't often come down her block. Curious, she stood up and looked toward them. Her dog followed her gaze, his ears perked, sensing something unfamiliar. The cars came to a stop near the curb. Two officers stepped out, their faces unreadable. They didn't seem rushed, but they looked around carefully, as if searching for something or someone. The girl felt her chest tighten with unease. She wasn't sure why they were there, but the sudden presence of authority in front of her home unsettled her. Her dog, loyal as ever, stayed close, his tail wagging slowly, unsure of the strangers in uniform. She bent down and stroked his fur to calm him, whispering softly, though she herself was growing more nervous. The officers walked closer, one of them speaking in a tone she couldn't quite understand. The words felt clipped, short, almost impatient. She tried to answer politely, her voice shaking a little, but the exchange only grew more confusing. And then, in the middle of that strange tension, everything changed. The young woman could not fully process what happened in those next few moments. 1 second she was holding on to the collar of her dog, trying to reassure him, and the next a terrible mistake unfolded before her eyes. Her beloved companion was gone in an instant, and the quiet joy of the afternoon was shattered like glass. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, unable to breathe. The world around her seemed to slow down. The officers' voices blurred into a noise she couldn't understand. Her knees grew weak and she sank to the ground, her hands trembling. She called her dog's name again and again, as if somehow he might answer. But there was only silence. The neighbors, who had been going about their daily routines, watering gardens, walking children home, unloading groceries, began to gather. One woman rushed across the street, putting her arm around the girl, trying to comfort her. Another man shouted questions at the officers, demanding to know why this had happened. Soon, more people appeared, phones in hand, recording, talking, shaking their heads. The girl could hardly hear them. She sat there, staring at the spot where just moments earlier her dog had been wagging his tail, chasing after a ball, full of life and joy. Her chest felt heavy, her throat tight, her eyes stinging with endless tears. She tried to speak, to ask for an explanation, but her voice cracked and no words would come. The officers seemed defensive now. They spoke to each other in low voices, avoiding the eyes of the neighbors. When someone asked them to explain, their answers were short, almost cold. To the young woman, it felt as though no one cared about her loss. It felt as though her pain was invisible to them, as if it was just another incident that would be forgotten by the end of the day. Her heart ached, not just from losing her beloved companion, but from the way the situation was being handled. She felt small, powerless, and unheard. The people around her tried to stand by her, but even then she could feel the wall between herself and the officers, a wall that words alone could not break down. The ball her dog had chased still sat in the grass untouched, a reminder of what had been. She picked it up with trembling hands, clutching it to her chest, and the tears came harder. Every memory of their walks, every night he curled up by her bed, every morning he greeted her at the door, it all came rushing back, overwhelming her heart. And yet, even through her pain, something inside her began to stir. She could not let this be brushed aside. She could not let this be just another forgotten story. As she wiped her face with the back of her hand, her eyes still red and swollen, she knew she had to do something. She didn't know exactly what, not yet, but deep down she felt a fire beginning to burn. She might have been just one young woman standing on her lawn, but she was not alone. The community had seen what had happened. They were already talking, already questioning, already demanding answers. She took a deep breath, though it trembled, on its way out, and looked at the officers again. She had never felt so broken, and yet she had never felt such determination building inside her. This was only the beginning. The news of what had just happened spread quickly through the neighborhood, faster than anyone expected. People who had only heard distant voices now came out of their homes, curious to see why a crowd was gathering. Soon, the once quiet street was filled with murmurs, whispers, and questions that nobody could answer. The young woman sat on the porch steps, her eyes red and swollen, her hands still holding tightly to her dog's collar, as though refusing to let go. Her body shook with every deep breath she tried to take, but the tears continued to fall. Neighbors stood nearby, some with their phones raised, recording every moment. Others tried to comfort her, placing gentle hands on her shoulders, speaking soft words, but she barely heard them. It was as if her mind was in a fog, replaying the last moments again and again. Every time she blinked, she could see her dog running across the grass, his tail wagging, his body full of life. And then, she would remember the silence that followed, the emptiness that settled in, and her heart would break all over again. Children who often played with her dog stood by their parents, clinging to their hands, their little faces full of confusion. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they felt the weight of sadness in the air. One child whispered to his mother, asking why the dog wasn't moving anymore, and the mother pulled him close, shaking her head, not knowing what to say. The young woman finally lifted her eyes and looked at the officers. Their expressions were unreadable, their stance stiff. To her, it felt as if they were more concerned with controlling the crowd than acknowledging her pain. Every time a neighbor shouted a question, "Why did this happen?" or "What were you thinking?" the officers replied with short, cold answers that only made people more upset. The disconnect between them and the community was growing, with each passing second. One of the neighbors, an older man who had lived on the street for decades, stepped forward. He raised his voice, calm but firm, asking for an explanation. He pointed out that the dog was loved by everyone on the block, that it had never harmed anyone. His words carried weight because everyone respected him, but even then the officers did not soften. They spoke in a tone that felt dismissive, and the crowd's frustration deepened. The young woman lowered her gaze again, pressing the collar tighter against her chest. She could hear the voices around her blending together, a mixture of sympathy, anger, and confusion. The world felt heavy, as though every sound and every sight was pressing down on her heart. She felt helpless, like a tiny voice in a storm, drowned out by noise and indifference. And yet, amid all the sorrow, she also noticed something else: unity. Her neighbors were not turning away. They were standing with her. Some offered tissues, some brought water, others simply stood by her side in silence, letting her know she was not alone. A woman knelt beside her, whispering gently that the entire neighborhood had her back, that they would not allow this to be swept aside. The girl tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. Finally, through tears, she managed to say, "He was my family." Her voice cracked, but it was strong enough for everyone nearby to hear. Those words carried a truth that settled heavily on the hearts of all who listened. Everyone knew how much she loved that dog. Everyone knew how much he meant to her. The officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing the crowd's emotions were growing stronger. Their cold professionalism could not mask the fact that the community was deeply hurt, and the center of that pain was sitting on the porch steps, clutching a reminder of what she had just lost. As time passed, the crowd only grew larger. Word spread beyond the block, and people from nearby streets came to see what was happening. Cars slowed as they drove past, their passengers staring, some even stopping to join the crowd. The once peaceful afternoon had turned into a scene of sorrow and tension, watched by dozens of eyes. The young woman, though consumed with grief, began to feel a spark of resolve. She realized that this was not just about her loss anymore. It was about the way she and her community were being treated, about the way voices were being ignored. She looked at the children watching, at the neighbors standing tall, and she knew that their presence mattered. They were witnesses. They were support. They were strength she could lean on. Her mind drifted back to happier times. She remembered walking her dog down the street, stopping to chat with neighbors, laughing when children ran up to pet him. She remembered the way he greeted her at the door every single day, tail wagging as though she was the most important person in the world. Those memories filled her heart with both pain and warmth. They reminded her that her dog's life had meant something, not just to her but to everyone around. The evening sun began to dip lower, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The light touched her face as she sat in silence, but inside, she was beginning to gather strength. She realized that grief alone would not be enough to honor her dog's memory. Something more had to be done. Something had to change. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and sat up straighter. Though her eyes were still wet and her chest still ached, she tried to steady her breathing. She looked around at the crowd, at the people who had come to support her, and nodded slowly. The neighbors noticed the shift in her posture, the way she seemed to be holding herself up despite the weight of her sorrow. One neighbor whispered to another, "She's strong." The words spread softly through the crowd, a recognition that despite the pain, she was not breaking. She was beginning to stand. The officers still spoke little, but the young woman no longer looked at them with helplessness. Instead, she studied them with quiet determination, her mind slowly forming the thought that she had options, that she was not powerless. The phone in her pocket felt heavier now, as though reminding her it was there. She knew she had someone she could call, someone who would listen, someone whose voice carried power. But she wasn't ready to make that call yet. Not just yet. For now, she let the moment sink in. She let the community's support wrap around her like a blanket. She let the truth settle in her heart, that even in the middle of sorrow, she was not alone. The grief was deep, but so was the unity. The confusion was strong, but so was the determination growing inside her. The dog's ball still lay on the grass, a silent symbol of everything she had lost. She glanced at it, then back at the crowd, and she understood something important. This moment would not be forgotten. This was no ordinary afternoon. This was the beginning of a story that would echo far beyond her yard. And as the sky darkened, slightly and the neighborhood buzzed with voices, she knew deep inside that her next step would change everything. Her hands trembled as she held the phone in her lap. The voices of the neighbors still surrounded her, but inside, she felt a quiet decision forming. She had cried until her eyes hurt. She had pleaded with her voice until it cracked. And still, the officers offered no real comfort. They stood at a distance now, speaking among themselves, while she sat with her neighbors standing protectively nearby. She felt grief, but beneath that grief she felt something else building, resolve. The collar in her hand reminded her of loyalty, love, and a bond that could never be replaced. But the phone in her pocket reminded her of something else. She was not as powerless as she felt. She had someone who always listened, someone who never dismissed her pain, someone who had spent his life standing up for the people of the city. That someone was her father, the mayor. For a long moment, she stared at the phone. She didn't want to make this about power. She didn't want anyone to think she was calling simply because she could. But as she looked at the children clinging to their parents, at the neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief, and at the officer standing in stiff silence. She realized this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever felt unheard. This was about showing that voices mattered, that pain could not simply be ignored. She unlocked the phone slowly, her fingers still shaking. The screen glowed in the dimming light, and she scrolled to the number she knew by heart. Her father's name stared back at her. Taking a shaky breath, she pressed the call button. The ringing echoed in her ear, each sound making her heart beat faster. When he answered, his voice was calm and warm, the way it always was when he spoke to her. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, and the sound of his voice almost made her break down again. She held her breath for a moment, trying to steady her voice. Then, in a soft but firm tone, she said, "Daddy, I need you. Please come. Something terrible happened." There was silence on the other end for a beat, and then his voice turned serious. "Tell me where you are. I'll be there right away." She didn't even have to explain everything. He could hear it in her voice. The pain, the urgency, the way her words shook, he understood. He promised he was on his way, and the call ended. She lowered the phone and held it tightly in her lap as if it were a lifeline. The neighbors closest to her leaned in, asking gently if she was okay, what she had done. She told them softly, "I called my father, he's coming." At first, they didn't fully react. But then, as the words sank in, people began to exchange looks. Her father wasn't just any father. He wasn't just a man who cared for his daughter. He was the mayor of the entire city. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. "The mayor? Did she say her father is the mayor?" Neighbors nodded, repeating the words, and within minutes everyone knew. A new energy rippled through the group. People stood a little taller, their voices a little stronger. It was no longer just a grieving girl facing the authorities. Now, it was the mayor's daughter. And that meant the situation was about to change. The officers noticed the shift. They glanced at one another, their stiff posture loosening slightly as uncertainty showed in their eyes. They had arrived with confidence, with an air of authority, but now there was something in the air they could not control. Accountability. The young woman sat quietly, her tears still drying on her cheeks. But now her heart beat with a different rhythm. She wasn't waiting just for comfort anymore. She was waiting for answers, and she was waiting with the knowledge that she would be heard. Her father had promised to come, and she knew when he arrived the silence surrounding her pain would end. Minutes passed slowly, each one filled with murmurs from the neighbors and side glances from the officers. Some people began to record again, their cameras capturing not just the scene, but the anticipation. They wanted to document every second because they knew this moment mattered. Finally, the distant hum of engines reached their ears. The young woman looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Down the street, a line of familiar vehicles approached, moving steadily toward the crowd. The mayor's car, followed by a second vehicle, pulled up to the curb. Doors opened and the presence of authority instantly changed. Her father stepped out, his face stern yet full of concern. He wasn't just the mayor in that moment. He was a father who had rushed to his daughter's side. The crowd parted slightly as he walked forward, his eyes scanning the scene until they fell on her. She stood up slowly, her legs weak but her spirit lifting. When she saw him, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. He embraced her first, holding her close as she whispered into his chest what had happened. He listened without interruption, his hand steady on her back, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finally pulled back, her face streaked with tears, he kissed her forehead gently, then turned his attention to the officers. The neighbors watched closely. The same officers who had stood with indifference now shifted uneasily under the gaze of the mayor. His voice was calm, but carried authority as he asked them to explain. No one dared to ignore him. The quiet determination in his tone demanded honesty. The young woman stood a step behind her father, surrounded by neighbors who now felt stronger than ever. She still held the collar in her hand, a reminder of what she had lost. But for the first time that day, she felt seen. She felt that her pain mattered. She felt that change was possible. The sun had nearly set by now, casting long shadows across the street. But instead of fading into darkness, the scene seemed to glow with a new light. The light of truth, of accountability, of a father standing for his daughter, and of a community standing together. What had begun as a tragedy in one young woman's yard was no longer just her story. It was a story that belonged to everyone present, a story that would soon reach the entire city. And at the center of it all was a phone call, one simple phone call, made with trembling hands, that turned grief into strength and silence into a voice that could not be ignored. The street had changed completely since the mayor arrived. What was once a quiet block filled with sorrow and confusion now carried an energy that everyone could feel. Neighbors who had been whispering now stood straighter, their voices growing, stronger as they spoke among themselves. The presence of the mayor was like a spark that turned their grief into determination. They knew this moment would not be ignored, not when the leader of their city stood in their midst. The young woman stood just behind her father, her hands still gripping the collar of her dog, her face marked by tears but her posture firm. For the first time that day, she felt that the silence was breaking, that her pain was no longer invisible. Her father's arm rested protectively on her shoulder as he turned to the officers who had caused this storm of sadness. His voice was calm but steady, the kind of voice that carried authority without needing to shout. He asked them to explain what had happened. His words were simple, but the weight behind them left no room for dismissal. The officers shifted uneasily. One of them cleared his throat and began to speak, but his voice lacked confidence. He used terms that sounded formal, as if reciting a report, but everyone in the crowd could tell that his explanation was weak. The mayor listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, his expression serious. The crowd grew quiet as they waited. Every person there wanted the truth, not excuses. The neighbors had seen what happened. They had stood by the girl in her grief, and now they wanted to see justice. The children who had once played with the dog clung to their parents, their wide eyes fixed on the scene, sensing that something important was happening. When the officer finished speaking, the mayor nodded slowly but said nothing right away. He looked at the second officer, asking him for his version. That man hesitated, his words faltering. His explanation was different in small ways, and the crowd noticed. Murmurs spread through the neighbors. It was clear that the two stories did not perfectly match, and that only made people more certain that something was wrong. The young woman watched carefully. Though her heart still ached, she felt stronger standing beside her father. She noticed how the officers avoided her gaze, how their confidence had faded since his arrival. Just an hour earlier, she had felt powerless, but now the balance had shifted. Her father finally spoke again, his voice firm. He reminded the officers that they were not above accountability, that their duty was to serve and protect, not to cause harm and then hide behind weak explanations. His words carried not just the authority of his position, but the conviction of a father standing for his daughter. The neighbors nodded in agreement, their voices rising in soft affirmations. The officers lowered their heads slightly, no longer standing as tall as they once did. The weight of the community's eyes, combined with the authority of the mayor, had shifted the power in the moment. The young woman could feel it. The tables were turning. What once felt like a wall she could never climb was beginning to crack. The mayor then addressed the crowd. He thanked them for standing with his daughter, for showing compassion and strength. He assured them that what had happened would not be swept aside, that it would be investigated fully, and that their voices would be heard. His words brought comfort to the neighbors, who cheered softly, nodding in agreement. They trusted him because he was not only their mayor, but also a father who clearly felt the same pain they did. The young woman felt a tear slip down her cheek. Again, but this time it wasn't only from sadness, it was from relief. For the first time that day, she felt that justice might be possible, that her loss was being recognized. She looked around at the crowd, people she had known for years, people who had watched her grow up, people who had played with her dog in the afternoons, and saw the unity on their faces. They were with her, and they weren't leaving her side. As the evening light faded, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the scene. The mayor remained calm, but firm as he continued speaking with the officers. making sure every word was noted. He asked for reports, for official documentation, for accountability. The officers, who had earlier seemed untouchable, now scrambled to respond properly, their words careful, their posture humbled. The neighbors whispered to each other about how quickly everything had changed. One woman remarked that just hours ago the officers hadn't cared to explain anything. Now, with the mayor present, they were forced to listen, forced to answer. Another man nodded, saying that this was proof of how important it was to have someone who would stand up and demand truth. The young woman listened, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew that without her father's arrival, things might have gone differently. She knew the pain of that afternoon would never leave her, but she also knew that calling him had given her voice a strength she could not find alone. She thought about her dog and how loyal he had always been, how he had stood by her side no matter what. In a way, she felt that now it was her turn to be loyal to his memory. She would not let his life be forgotten. She would make sure his story was told, not just as a loss, but as a turning point for change. As the mayor finished his conversation with the officers, he turned back to his daughter. He placed his hand on her shoulder again and gave her a reassuring nod. Without words, he told her that she was not alone, that he would carry this burden with her. The crowd clapped softly, some even wiping their own tears. The night air grew cooler, but the warmth of unity lingered. Neighbors stayed close, refusing to leave until they knew she was all right. Some offered to bring food. Others offered to stay with her so she wouldn't feel alone. Their kindness touched her deeply. Even in the middle of sorrow, there was so much love. She stood a little taller now, her grief still heavy but her spirit stronger. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something larger, something that would reach far beyond this street. She didn't yet know how far the ripples would travel, but she could already feel them spreading. And as she looked at the familiar faces of her neighbors, at the quiet strength of her father, and at the humbled stance of the officers, she realized something important. Power can shift, tables can turn, and even the smallest voice can grow louder when it is lifted by truth, by family, and by community. This day had started with laughter and ended with tears, but it was also the day she learned how quickly pain could turn into purpose. And she knew, deep in her heart, that her story, and her dog's memory, was far from over. The night had fully settled over the neighborhood, but the street still buzzed with quiet energy. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into something unforgettable, and no one wanted to leave until they were certain the young woman was all right. The glow of the streetlights cast soft shadows across the faces of the neighbors who had stayed, and the mayor's presence continued to give them comfort. For the young woman, the ache in her heart remained, but alongside it, a steady sense of strength had taken root. Her father stood by her side, speaking calmly to the people around them. He promised that this moment would not vanish into silence, that the truth would be brought forward. His words carried weight, and the crowd believed him. They had seen him lead before, but this time it was different. This time he wasn't just their mayor. He was a father who had come to protect his daughter, and that made his promises even more powerful. The young woman looked around at the faces in the crowd. She saw neighbors who had watched her grow up, children who had played with her dog, and strangers who had joined simply because they believed in fairness. Every face reflected the same feeling: support. It amazed her how quickly the entire block had come together. In her pain, she had thought she was alone, but now she realized she had never truly been alone at all. One by one, neighbors stepped forward to offer her words of comfort. Some shared memories of her dog, how he had run happily down the street, how he had greeted them at their doors, how gentle he had been with their children. Hearing those stories filled her with both sorrow and warmth. Sorrow because she would never see those moments again, but warmth because she knew he had left behind a trail of kindness in the lives he had touched. His presence had mattered not only to her but to the entire community. Her father listened as well, nodding respectfully, making sure that everyone felt heard. He knew that this moment was larger than just one family. It was about trust between people and those who served them. It was about making sure that no voice was silenced. The officers who had once stood confidently were now quiet, their expressions uneasy under the steady gaze of the mayor and the watchful eyes of the neighbors. They gave short answers when questioned, and though they tried to remain professional, it was clear that they no longer controlled the moment. The power had shifted. Eventually, as the night grew late, the mayor encouraged his daughter to return, home and rest. But before she could take a single step toward her house, she turned to the crowd. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying more strength than she had realized she still had. She thanked them. She thanked each and every person who had stayed, who had stood by her, who had made her feel less alone in the darkest hours of her life. Her words moved the crowd. Some nodded, some smiled gently, and some even had tears in their eyes. They knew the courage it took for her to speak while still carrying so much grief. They admired her strength. When she finally walked inside with her father, the quiet of her home felt heavy. She sat down in the living room, still holding the collar in her hand, and let out a deep breath. The memories of the day pressed against her heart, but she also felt a flicker of peace knowing she had not faced it alone. Her father sat beside her, telling her gently that the coming days would bring many questions, but that she would not have to answer them alone. He promised her that justice would follow step by step, and he kept his word. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. News outlets reported on what had happened, focusing not just on the tragedy, but on the response that came after. People across the city spoke about the young woman's courage, about how one phone call had brought accountability into the light. The mayor's presence at the scene had ensured that this would not be brushed aside. Investigations were opened, reports were written, and actions were taken. The young woman, though still grieving, found herself at the center of attention. Reporters wanted to speak with her, community leaders wanted to meet her, and people she had never met before sent her letters of support. At first, it overwhelmed her. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight. But as she read those letters and listened to the voices of people who believed in her, she began to understand something important. Her pain had become a symbol of change, a reminder that every voice mattered, no matter how small it felt at the time. Her neighbors continued to support her too. They visited her home, brought food, sat with her when she felt alone, and reminded her that they were there. The children often spoke about her dog, remembering how he had been kind and playful. Those small memories brought her comfort, helping her hold on to the good even in the midst of loss. Her father never left her side, for long. Even when his work as mayor pulled him away, he made sure to check on her, to remind her that she was his priority. Their bond grew even stronger through the experience. She had always admired his strength as a leader, but now she admired his strength as a father even more. He had shown her that family and community were the foundations that held everything together. Weeks later, as the investigation reached its conclusion, the officers involved were held accountable for their actions. Procedures were changed, and promises were made to ensure that such mistakes would not happen again. The young woman attended a public meeting where city leaders discussed those changes. She sat quietly at first, but when asked to speak, she rose to her feet. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the room. She spoke about love, about loss, and about the importance of being heard. She spoke not with anger, but with honesty. She reminded everyone that her dog had been more than just a pet. He had been her family, her friend, her joy. And she reminded them that no one's voice should ever be dismissed, no matter who they are. The room fell silent as she finished, and then applause filled the air. People admired her courage, her grace, and the way she had turned her grief into strength. She didn't see herself as a hero, but to many, that's exactly what she had become. As time passed, she carried her dog's memory in her heart with pride. She would sometimes walk down the same street where they had once played, holding the old ball he used to chase. The children would run up to her, telling her their favorite stories about him, and she would smile through the sadness. In those moments, she realized that his spirit lived on through the love he had given and the change he had inspired. Her father often reminded her that the phone call she made that evening had been more than a call for help. It had been the turning point in a story that showed an entire city the power of standing together. It had shown that even in moments of sorrow, strength can be found, and even in moments of silence, a voice can rise. The young woman knew she would never forget that day. She knew the pain would always remain a scar on her heart. But she also knew that from that pain came unity, change, and hope. And though her dog was no longer by her side, his memory walked with her every step of the way. In the end, it wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of love, of courage, of a daughter's voice, and of a father's promise. It was a story of a community that refused to let one of their own face grief alone. And above all, it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes a single phone call can change everything.